Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 13 of our study, which covers the Book of Genesis, chapters 22 and 23. In this lesson, we talk about one of the odder things that happens in the Old Testament. The not quite sacrifice of Isaac by his father Abraham at God's request. This is an off-putting thing, right? How could God ask someone to do what God seems to ask Abraham to do? And how could Abraham agree to do it? And does God put people to the test that way? That seems like kind of a jerk thing to do. This is very much, in isolation, off-putting. The important thing, I think, is that this is not in isolation. This passage in particular doesn't come into fruition and come into its meaning until the New Testament. That's true of so many things in the Old Testament, but this one is maybe the starkest example, right? How could God ask Abraham to do that? God does that. And it's not just putting to the test when God does it. God says to Abraham, sacrifice your son Isaac, knowing that he will not have Abraham do that. This is foreshadowing to us that is a thing that God doesn't think is impossible to be necessary. God then does that. We'll talk more about it, but we have a fascinating conversation that exists in two parts, half in the Old Testament and half in the New Testament. We don't know what God says to Jesus at Gethsemane. We know Jesus says, if there is a way, take this cup away from me. It's an oddly one-sided conversation. Here, we have an oddly one-sided conversation where we know what Abraham is saying to Isaac, and we don't know what Isaac is saying to Abraham. We have the Father speaking in the Old Testament and the Son speaking in the New Testament. And we have both sides of that conversation, and the two accounts together come together to show us both perspectives of especially the sacrifice of Jesus. This is here to lay the foundation for understanding what happens from God's point of view with the sacrifice of the Son. Abraham, unfortunately, volunteers to be the one to help us understand that perspective, because that wouldn't be super fun to be Abraham. But it speaks so highly of how God views Abraham that elsewhere in the Bible and in typology, people stand in for Jesus or Jesus' mother fairly often. It is extremely rare that someone stands in for God the Father. Yet another reason it's so appropriate to call Abraham our father in the faith. I think viewed in isolation, this is a very hard passage. I think viewed in that context, this starts to make sense. And so we will do that as we go through it. And I think it's equally important to know God isn't doing this to test Abraham. God is doing this to set up something thousands of years later so that we can fully understand a different thing that's going to happen. This isn't just God saying, I need to test this guy Abraham. He's done everything I've ever asked him to do, and I'm not sure that that's enough. So I'm going to make him do a horrible thing so that I know he really has faith in me. That's where this is so off-putting, right? That can't be our God, right? Who loves us. That's not how we see that. And this seems at odds with that. But when that's not what this is, then that's okay, right? And this is instead helping us to actually more fully understand God's love for us in what he does later, and not just God being a jerk to Abraham. So that is the lens that we will use when we go through this passage, and I think it'll be a lot less off-putting as we do that. The other point to make by way of introduction is this is also where I alluded, and we saw in the last lesson with the well at Beersheba, Abraham sort of having some kind of acknowledged ownership in the Holy Land in the form of a well. But that's pretty limited. Here he actually obtains a piece of land in the Holy Land, in the burial place for Sarah. And that burial place remains significant into past Exodus and beyond for a lot of reasons, right? You've got Joseph's bones being brought back, you've got it being where the patriarchs are buried, and you've got ideas of God's people and their claim to any part of the Holy Land, and what is home in life and death. It's an interesting conceptual thing, and an important shift away from being God's people being outside of their home and like journeying and finding their way to an established and a permanent home. And it's, again, the foreshadowing is so profound that they only reach their true promised home in death. It's a tomb. And of course, for us, the same is true. So much interesting typology and symbolism here that we'll unpack as we go through it. What a conversation. Abraham is used to talking with God, even pushing back and challenging God a little bit. Remember the incident of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham said, God, I don't think that the thing you're talking about is who you are, and I don't think you would do that, right? And God said, yes, Abraham, that's correct. That's not who I am. I wouldn't do that, over the destruction of some people who very clearly deserved it. This time, God says, Abraham, I have a great idea. The thing you're going to do is take your only begotten son, Isaac, we'll come back to that, the one that you love, and you're going to go offer him as a burnt offering. Remember, and that's the whole conversation. Remember, we have precedent of when Abraham disagrees with something that God is suggesting, him responding back and saying, that doesn't seem right. He doesn't do that here. He just goes along with this. This is the conversation. Abraham is on board with this thing. How on earth can that be? And that's where we get back into our typology. There's a big clue here about that going on. Isaac is not Abraham's only begotten son. He's his only legitimate, within the context of his marriage, son. But that is not the same as only begotten. The word is just wrong. It's in the Bible. It's truthful, but it's wrong. How could that, why on earth would that be the case? That the author of this bit is totally pretending like Ishmael doesn't exist. Again, you have some different authorship in some parts of this. It works out, or wasn't aware even. Who knows what tradition different people were aware of when they were working through this. What matters for our purposes is this happens again. And when it happens again, it is the only begotten Son of God, who also has, in a sense, two sons. One who is not legitimate in the sense of being begotten. Adam was created, Adam was not begotten. And Adam was not the one who is going to inherit all of God's everything. Promise, potential, kingdom, whatever is God's is inherited by God's begotten Son, Jesus Christ, and not by Adam. And we come into our inheritance from God through Christ and not through Adam, even though we're all descendants of Adam. So in a very similar way here, God has two sons and only one who is begotten. And that one is, the first one is kind of shoved off to the side a little bit and loses the relationship with the father, a thing that God also asks Abraham to do with Ishmael. And the second one is put in the place of primacy and is a part of what that means is being sacrificed and being willing to be sacrificed. Being in a son in this line and what it inherits means being willing to be sacrificed. And being a father in this line means being willing to sacrifice. That is a fundamental thing about God and this lineage that is meant to bring blessing to humanity, right? What is the purpose? The promises to Abraham are, you're going to have the land, great. You're going to have all these descendants. That seems difficult right now. And you're going to be a blessing to all the peoples. It turns out that this is how you can become a blessing to all the peoples. And if you're going to hold back on this, you cut yourself out of that part of what is you're not the chosen. You're not the one to receive the promise, right? Because you're not in a position where you're ready to do that. So again, that parallel helps us make sense of this thing, that it's not just Abraham in isolation. But fascinatingly, Abraham sees this as a valid request and doesn't say, wait, God, I think you're maybe kind of crazy here. This is not a thing we're doing. What's important is God is saying, Abraham, I want you to be like me. And Abraham is saying, I want that too. Above all other things, I want that too. And that's the thing for us, right? Being Christian does involve significant sacrifice. In our case, it's Jesus Christ, whom we're called to imitate, he makes it more accessible, right? We don't know God the Father, who is far off and far removed, is hard to know and to imitate, right? Christ shows us the Father so that we can better be like him. But our pathway is to be like Jesus Christ. So our call is more directly to be sacrificed rather than to sacrifice. But it functionally, there's not that much difference in the father and son relationship between sacrificing and being sacrificed, right? In both cases, there is great loss. That's the closer that loving relationship between father and son is, the closer to identical those two things are. And we know father and son are, two parts of one triune God who are as close as it's possible to be. So that for us, imitating Christ and being willing to be sacrificed is a form also of imitating God in the sacrifice. Fascinatingly. The point being, if we are not willing to be like Jesus Christ, what are we doing being Christians? And if we are not willing to sacrifice to be like Jesus Christ, we are not willing to be like Jesus Christ. So the model here and the thing to imitate, and where this is really hard, and this is where this puts people off, is, of course, I could never do this. I wouldn't do this. This isn't fair. This isn't appropriate. This isn't okay. You're supposed to think that, and then be aware that God did it anyway. And that because God did it, you are asked to as well. But God's not asking you to do a thing that he has not already done. But in our cases, it's mostly not sacrificing a loved one. It's unless we love ourselves that much, right? It's sacrificing yourself in the Christian context, or your idea of yourself, right? And so we have our setup that somehow God brings this up and Abraham says yes. So Abraham takes Isaac and a couple of servants on a field trip. The idea of which being, Isaac, we're going to go offer a sacrifice to the Lord together. Isaac is not initially made aware of the nature of the intended sacrifice. This could be a horror movie, right? The tension here of knowing what the father is planning to do and the son not knowing and them going to do it and the things building into that, that is a suspense thriller or a horror movie, right? You could even see him like sharpening the knife and like getting things ready, and it has different meanings to Abraham, to Isaac, and to outside spectators, right? This is a very short, blessedly, but tense thing to think about happening, right? With the mismatched expectations about the purpose of what's going on. Abraham doesn't lie, but he's not forthcoming. When Isaac asks, I see the fire and the wood, where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham says God will provide himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. If he didn't work in the word lamb there, it wouldn't be a lie at all. It's a little bit misleading when he's referring to Isaac as a lamb here. Although, as we'll see, God ends up making Abraham's statement quite true indeed. But this is This is just a tense thing, right? And Abraham is just doing it. And Isaac is there on the field trip with his father thinking things are normal. There's another layer to this as well, in that this is one of those things, like, it takes the amount of time it took to get to Jesus to develop all of the parts of what's involved in that for us to understand what was done. This is not where we understand what offering or sacrifice means, right? That develops later in Exodus and beyond. We don't have the framework for that being a thing that can take away sins yet, right? Or all of the things that's going to try to grow into and fail at until Jesus. Go through our Exodus study for more on all of that if you haven't. Would be a great follow-up to this one. We don't know or have any of that yet, right? Even formally what a burnt offering is not really. Here they have fire and a lamb and a knife, and like they don't have all the vestments, like they don't have all the tools, they have to build an altar. This is a very different thing from what happens in the rest of the Old Testament, in that none of that precedent is here. There's none of the suggestion that something positive comes from this, right? That's what happens later, is you make a sacrifice and something positive happens too, right? It's an exchange, it's a trade, it affects something positive in the exchange. That's not here yet. This is just, Abraham, you should sacrifice your son. Okay, God, what do I get out of it? You sacrifice your son. Okay. That is, we later see also in the letter to the Hebrews that St. Paul tells us that Abraham's reasoning was, well, I didn't have a son, and it was impossible that I was going to have a son, and now here I have this son, thanks to God. So if he can do that, then he can do anything, even raise my son from the dead. And St. Paul tells us that is Abraham's faith here. And that also, New Testament perspective, helps us look at this and not think Abraham is a monster, right? He is not, and again, creates a similarity between Abraham and God the Father. Abraham will sacrifice his son, but he's not thinking that necessarily means he will lose his son somehow. So that what he's going to, he still has to do violence to his son, which is horrifying. But that doesn't mean that he necessarily thinks he will lose his son. That would be contradictory to the promises God has made to him, right? God has basically said, here's your son Isaac, and that's your lineage, and you're going to be a father of many, many nations and many people. You can't do that without Isaac. So Abraham is very much taking God at his word on that as well. There's so much dissonance in the things that are going on here. It's a very tense situation. So they travel together to the designated place, carrying the wood for the sacrifice. One can presume, again, parallels, that Isaac was carrying at least some of the wood for his own sacrifice. We see that he might not have been carrying it on his back in the same way as Jesus carried the cross. But the symbolism is, and the comparison is nonetheless apparent. Where there is a difference between Isaac and Jesus is there's at least a strong suggestion that Isaac is not wholly willing to do this. Right? They have a rope and he's bound. If he's willing to be there and be sacrificed, he doesn't need to be tied up. This is where, while Abraham is a type of God the Father, Isaac is not to the same extent a type of God the Son. He is insofar as he's being sacrificed. He's not insofar as he's not being sacrificed. It seems that he may not be being sacrificed willingly. And that's where it becomes so interesting that we get here, we don't get his part of the conversation because it's not correct, right? It's not from what God intends. Abraham's part of this is correct. So we get his part of it. Isaac's isn't. How could humanity do that? How could someone be willing for that? The son falls short of the father until Jesus comes. And then we get the other half of the conversation as it was meant to be. God, Father, if there is a way, take this cup away from me. But not my will, but your will be done. That is Isaac's response as it should have been, which is easy to say. But if you're the son being sacrificed, you're going to try not to be as well, right? That's the point. The point is we wouldn't do this. We wouldn't do Abraham's part, and if we were in Isaac's place, we wouldn't do it willingly. We would not do this. This is not how people do things. It has to be the parent-child component of this only serves to drive home. This is not what we do or a thing that we would do. I would never take someone close to me and sacrifice that person for someone not close to me. You don't, even a lot of people not close to me. That equation isn't how that works. We don't do that. And I certainly wouldn't be willing to be sacrificed for people not close to me. We don't do that. And so here, it's not a slight on Isaac that he's bound, but it also, we don't get the binding part of it, which is, you don't need to see it, right? You need to know that it happened, and you can imagine, but the stress of that from both people's side, it's horrible, right? But it's not more horrible than the crucifixion. And the thing that stays different there is that both parties are fully willing and bought into what's happening. Whereas Jesus doesn't have to be bound, he goes willingly. And Isaac is not. Isaac is all of us, and not Jesus in this. And the contrast also matters, right? The contrast also matters a lot because we are called to not be Isaac, but to be Jesus. But that is, of course, or even Abraham, but that is, of course, a lot to ask. This is why it baffles my mind that people take Christianity lightly, right? You have people just kind of go into church whenever, and it's just sort of off to the side and a thing that happens along with all of the other things. I've got my job, I've got my various relationships, I've got my hobbies, and I'm a Christian, and all those things are equal. No. Christianity is this. It is it can be violent and brutal, and for a purpose. The important thing, and what happens here, is God steps in and says, psych, or maybe that wasn't the right time to make a joke, and says, stop. Abraham, stop. This has gone far enough to set the foundation we need. We don't have to kill your son. We've got what we need for the future generations. And you have definitely showed that I made the right choice in you. But definitely don't kill your son. That is both is and isn't what God does himself. Jesus does die, but of course he doesn't die, right? The thing that St. Paul tells us Abraham reasoned about Isaac is true about Jesus. Maybe not about Isaac, since God stops that. There's not really a way yet that people can come back from the dead. So it's probably good that that stopped. But God knows that through his son, people can come back from the dead. So that Jesus is killed, but he's also very much not killed. Or at least not in a way that lasts. So God does stop Jesus' sacrifice from ending in his death, even though it kind of goes through his death. So again, the layers are fascinating, and the complexity that this adds to our view of what happens in Jesus' sacrifice is significant. And again, I know I'm focusing on that a lot, but as I said, I think this whole thing doesn't make any sense outside of that context. So at any rate, narratively, where we're at is this stopped. What we don't see ever is what this does to the father-son relationship. Jesus' relationship with his father is not harmed by what is done. But Jesus was also willing. It seems hard to think that Abraham and Isaac would ever be on really great terms after this, when Isaac wasn't willing. You chose God over me. It also makes you wonder, what is Isaac's relationship with God after this? Why would you do this? And yet, Isaac, every bit as much as Abraham, is a patriarch, and a key and important player in salvation history. But I think there's a reason that his story is relatively truncated. We have his birth being a big deal, we have this, we have his marriage, and we have his children. And that's Isaac. And we don't have a lot of conversation between Isaac and God. And his son, who becomes the one to inherit this blessing, initially also doesn't have a strong relationship with God and has to undergo a conversion. I think it's fair to say, and we have a lot of parents in this world who are serious about their faith and struggle with their children not being. Like, this is that, right? The part of the patriarchs that gets glossed over a lot. Isaac very understandably does not have the same relationship with God that his father does. And it looks like the trajectory for how that family interacts with God is going downward, right? Like, it's problematic and it's imperiled, and God has to intervene to restore the family into that good relationship with God, which we'll talk about. Like, I think it's under-realized how much of a multiple conversion experiences Jacob needs to have before he can stand in the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We'll definitely talk quite a bit about that. It's also very interesting. But we look over, we don't really see much of Isaac's relationship with God. And, it's hard to say that this isn't why. If his relationship with his father was strained and with God is strained, like, it's kind of understandable. But of course his children know who God is, right? But I think understanding that also colors some of what happens and how it's approached when Abraham decides he needs a wife for Isaac. I think that makes more sense in the context of viewing Isaac as having a strained relationship with Abraham and God. So that'll be interesting to think about as well. Then, and this is more foreshadowing, more typology, God provides a ram in place of Isaac. That's offered as a burnt offering instead. There's a point of view in which you can say basically Abraham was like ready to offer the sacrifice, and instead of saying stop, God said pause, and paused for a long time and swapped out unwilling Isaac with willing Jesus, and then said resume, and things picked up right up where they left off. God provides a ram, his son, right? The sheep coming in is like part of the pause, right? Like, okay, we're here to do a sacrifice, but we're not doing the one that we started. We will do this now, but also, like, the ram I'm providing, that's not this. That's coming later. That's my son, who is also Abraham, your son, many, many times removed. To be continued on the sacrificing. For now, here's a ram. And then God speaks from heaven, the angel, sorry, not God, good to be precise. Through the angel, God speaks again to Abraham. Note to Abraham, we're not seeing, somebody's missing who we know is right there. And as you can imagine where Isaac's head is at this point. But he's not in this conversation with God. And if he were, or if he had been, I'm not sure he would have taken a lot of comfort in the angel saying, by the way, Abraham, our deal is still on. I am going to multiply and bless you, and all the nations will bless themselves by you as well. And by your descendants shall all the nations of the earth bless themselves. That's also an interesting turn of phrase, right? That I wanted to make sure I got right here. It's not just you will be a blessing, but there's a component of them blessing themselves as well. Like, this is a needed thing, but something is also important here as well. And then the other component of that that hasn't been in the promises before, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. That's sort of David, but again, that's kind of exactly what happens when we hit unpause, right? Is the biggest enemy of all, the devil, death, is overcome as soon as we hit unpause to this thing that started. Because Abraham started it, right? It's like the starting of this set into motion and God, who doesn't see time the same way we do, it's like it's started with Abraham and like immediately then finished in Christ, and all of these things come together and the promises are fulfilled at the time that the sacrifice is fulfilled. um, it's just fascinating, right? Again, in isolation and just the Old Testament, it's straight up horrifying. In the bigger picture, with the New Testament to fill it in, it's fascinating. So God reiterates his promises to Abraham, and then Abraham and Isaac have what must be the most awkward return trip ever and go back home. It's not like they can like throw on an audiobook in the car to distract them, right? This is days and days of journeying with just those two and some servants. Not a fun return trip, I'm sure. But they go back home. So now we pick back up with what is going to become a relevant genealogy. Abraham's brother, Nahor, has also had some children. And within that branch, one of those children is Rebecca, who doesn't matter for the rest of this lesson, but she matters, right? Everybody knows, but in case somebody doesn't know, I won't spoil it. But all of this is about letting us know vaguely the connection between Abraham's line and Rebecca, who's going to matter. Now we switch gears pretty abruptly here. And Sarah dies, as people her age often do, 127 years old. That part is normal. The interesting thing that happens is Abraham decides in life it was okay for her to be a stranger and a sojourner in the Holy Land, in the land of promise. It's not the Holy Land yet. In the land of promise. But in death, that needed to be her home. In life, she was only a visitor. In death, she needs to belong. And so, Abraham seeks to acquire land as a permanent possession in the Holy Land, so that he has a place for her to dwell. We'll get into, it's a big deal that he would actually own the land, right? And how that would go to work. And that it would be like his and his family's and a thing that is theirs. It seems like that is different from how they've been sojourning and living there before. And it marks a big shift that he would even be allowed to own anything like that. This, again, is a very strong typological suggestion of our relationship with heaven, right? While we are here on earth sojourning, we have no permanent home in heaven. We're not there. We don't own it. We have no right to property or to dwelling there. But in our death, by gracious allowance of the owners of that land, we can be allowed some share or stake as a permanent possession in that, now I will say it, promised land. That is our relationship with our promised destined land, right? We are at best, while we're alive on this earth, travelers and sojourners. And our residency only becomes permanent in death. that makes sense now. That is fascinating to think that that's the thing that happened that far back with the patriarchs, and that that's a thing that Abraham is setting up. The typology is incredible. So that's the big deal about what's going on here. We'll go through the rest of it, but that part is what is really interesting. So Abraham goes to the Hittites, who are the owners of the land, and says, what we've talked about, right? I want to own a place that I can bury my dad. And this is where we see, like, they liked Abraham, right? Like, a great prince among us, right? He's done well being at peace and on good terms with his neighbors. And everything seems peaceful, friendly, and collaborative. And they say, yeah, nobody is going to tell you no to that. Figure out what place you want and let us know. And by all means. And we'll get into it. There's a bit of a debate, but it's important. A bit important, at least, not compared to maybe everything else in this lesson. But Abraham is insistent that he pay for this, even when it is potentially being offered for free. Within the context of the story, the reason for that is what is given can be taken back. What is sold is owned, right? Like, to really have the stake, he has to own it. And to really own it, especially when it seems like, as a foreigner, his right to own land was not really, he didn't have other land. It's a big deal. He has to buy it. From his point of view, it's very important that he pay the full price for it and that he buy it. This exchange also fits the typology, right? We both have a place prepared for us in heaven that God is very happy to extend to us and say, here, I would like to give you this. And at the same time, we cannot claim it unless we pay the price for it. So it is offered by God as a gift, but it still must be paid for by us in order to claim it, right? Again, like a silly story about a territory disputes and ownership, again becomes, and always was, a profound statement about how we come into possession of our place in the kingdom of heaven. That happens a lot, right, in the Old Testament. This kind of typology is everywhere. And often if there's something that seems out of context, not that important, even jarring, like taken in isolation, like if we tried to read just the first half of this lesson and the Abraham and Isaac bit, can be jarring, shocking, out of place, weird. In those cases, it is usually very instructive to look at it as half a story or as a foreshadowing or a typology. And often there can be something else going on that comes into greater significance later if you start to think about it from that typological point of view. Not that easy to do all the time, and it's also, if you start going down that road, like without being prayerfully anchored in God and the tradition, you can get some really weird ideas that are bad too, right? I think anybody who starts trying to, this person clearly means this person, and that thing means that, and that says this about the date that the world is going to end, for example, or whatever. There are ways that this goes crazy, right? So caution, but if you see a thing that doesn't make sense, it's also helpful to know that there is this bigger picture of how these things fit together that can make more sense of things that don't. And whether we can see it always or not, there could be other layers as well. At any rate, Abraham is buying a tomb in the Holy Land. And this is just the conclusion of the deal, right? We have already established Abraham is going to pay for it. They try to give it to him. They go back and forth. They ultimately agree to sell it to him on his insistence. They do that, and then he has this land. And Sarah is presumably buried in the tomb, and others will be later. So the field of Ephron and Machpelah it comes back up, right? And this cave and this tomb that are on it come back up. So because the words are foreign, it's like a hard thing to recognize maybe when it comes back up, which is why I'm saying that several times, right? It doesn't really matter greatly anywhere, but it will be referenced again, and it's useful elsewhere in the Bible, and it's neat to know that this is the origin of that and how it came into their possession. This has been an overview of Lesson 13 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. In the beginning, the book of Genesis. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.